Thanks so much. Great to be here. And I hope I have some milk from that cow after the talk tonight. So it's great to come up to Butler. I've always loved to come up. I was here at St. Paul's back in September, and then my friends from St. John's are here. So a couple of people, we might hear some same stories tonight. So I'm sorry if I repeat some of myself from my St. John's homilies. But it's great to come up. And so when Father Harry had asked me back in February to come up and do this talk, I thought, okay, I'll come. And then, you put things away. You don't think about them for a while. And then, all of a sudden, and I told this to St. John's, the bishop had asked me to come to Rome with him on a pilgrimage that just came up all of a sudden. And then Cheryl, the secretary, was asking me, well, Father, what is your talk? And I thought, I don't know what my talk is supposed to be about. So that day, I was near the tomb of St. John Paul II. And I thought, okay, we'll do the new evangelization from St. John Paul II to Pope Francis. Because I don't know if you've seen these statistics, right? And we're doing this on mission thing, and you've seen how from the year 2000 till 2015, we're down 40% on mass attendance in the Diocese of Pittsburgh. And maybe you've seen that we have 3 priests under 30, and we're losing priests, and we have all these retirements coming up. And so one of the big themes that's been coming out of the on-mission sessions is, hope. That we really need to look at how we talk to people, how we evangelize people, what we do as Catholics, how we invite people back to the faith. And so, I was thinking about that, and I was thinking about St. John Paul II. If you know me, and I've maybe told you some stories, I spent about 10 years in Rome, and I lived in Rome for about 10 years. When I was in the seminary, and then I came back to Pittsburgh, and I was at St. Margaret's in Greentree, and then I went back to Rome in 2008 to work on a canon law degree. And I should tell you, I'm ordained 12 years, and Father Kevin Fazio and I are the same age. He might be a little bit older than me, but he's the rookie because he's been ordained a lot less than me. And I tell him that all the time, so if you ever see him, you can tell him he's the rookie. But so I've been ordained 12 years, and now my job, I'm not in a parish, my job is to do all the canon law. I'm what's called a canon lawyer, so I run the legal office for the diocese. And so I've been kind of front and center looking at all these statistics. And so that day in Rome, I thought, well, this is a really important topic to talk about. I think something really important. And I looked at the tomb of St. John Paul II, and I was transported back to a story that I heard of. I was only 7 years old. Or 6 years old, I guess, when he was elected Pope, in 1978. And I don't know if you remember, if you've been around that long, but in 79, John Paul wanted to do one thing. He wanted to go back to Poland. And he was elected in October of 1978, and he wanted to go back to Poland as his first kind of apostolic visit, as his first voyage. And so, if you remember, Poland was under a communist, atheist regime back in 1979. And that was one of the first things he wanted to do. But he said, I'd really like to go back to Poland. But the communist officials were in a quandary because they thought, what should we do? Should we let this Pope come back and kind of give us a hard time? Because we're worried about the Soviets, from Russia, that if John Paul II comes back and there's a riot because he incites the people to riot, then the Soviets are going to come in and overtake us. However, if we don't let him in, if we don't let him come back, then we're going to look like we're afraid, and there's going to be consequences from us looking afraid. So what should we do? And so finally, they agreed to let John Paul II come back for his first apostolic visit in June of 1979, so like 9 months after he was elected Pope. And so they thought, well, all right, what we need to do is do a little bit of a campaign before he comes back. And we need to tell people about who this guy really is. Because remember, he was the Archbishop of Krakow. So the communists started putting out material about John Paul II, especially into the schools, about don't listen to this Pope when he comes back, this Karol Wojtyła. We know him. We remember him from his days, and he uses this sense of humor that he has, and he uses this charm. But underneath it all, he really is an enemy of the Polish people. He's really an enemy of ours. And so they kind of put this story out about him before he came back. And so then when he came back, stories were that they were expecting to have crowds. They thought maybe, a couple thousand would show up when he came back to line the streets when he came in from the airport. And then at the masses, they weren't really sure what to expect. But they weren't getting ready for too big a crowds. The communists weren't. Well, the day he gets back to Poland, into Warsaw, flies into Warsaw, and there are thousands, and tens of thousands, and almost 1 million people there lining the streets to welcome him back, and they're all cheering for him. And his first mass was in Victory Square in Warsaw, the big communist square where communist tanks would go by, and all these things would happen, and there was this big mass there. So John Paul starts to preach, and he starts talking to the people about the love that they should have for Christ, and about how the church has been central into helping them understand who Christ is. And this is what he says. This is what John Paul II says in his homily. He says, to Poland, the church brought Christ. The key to understanding that great and fundamental reality that is the human person. For the human person cannot be fully understood without Christ. Or rather, the human person is incapable of understanding himself fully without Christ. He cannot understand who he is, nor what his true dignity is, nor what his vocation is, nor what his final end is. The human person cannot understand any of this without Christ. And as the Pope started saying this, I don't know if you remember this, these are the people who are under atheist, communist rule, so that they're trying to get rid of Christ and God out of their society. They don't want God in their society, the communist government. And the people start chanting, we want God, we want God, we want God. And it went on. And it was like this song that they sang. We want God in our books. We want God in our classrooms. We want God. We want God. We want God in our marketplace. We want God in our conversations. We want God. We want God. And they said it went on for about 15 minutes in Victory Square. That was, I think, the first time the communists knew, that was the first crack that the communists knew that they were in trouble. And authors would say that was the downfall of communism, right? That began the downfall of communism right there. But John Paul II knew, right? He knew what was going on. He knew is the more and more that the atheist communist government tried to pull God out of people's lives, and out of the people's thoughts, and out of the people's conversations, and out of the books, and out of schools, that the more the people would have this longing. That there would be this more deep, fundamental longing. So in the same trip, there's a town called Nowa Huta. In Pittsburgh, in Butler, it would be kind of one of our cities. Because Nowa Huta was literally called the New Mill. Because the communists put a steel mill there. It was right after World War II. And they built everything in Nowa Huta. It was a brand new city next to Krakow, and they were going to replace Krakow with Nowa Huta. And so they planned for everything. They built shops, they built hospitals, they built schools, they built everything that you could need, except for one thing, the church. It's the only thing that they didn't build, because they didn't want God in their new reality, in their new society. So Karl Wojtyła was very instrumental in working on petitioning the government, protesting, fighting for a church. And in this big field in Nowa Huta, the protesters put up a cross. And they put up this cross to remind themselves of what was going to come, that there would be a church. And I think in the end, it took like 20 years for them to put this church into Nowa Huta. But the story goes that one day, I think it was in the like late 60s, that one early, it was early one morning, right before the night shift of the steel mill was getting off. And so early one morning, the communist officials come by, and they start to try to take down this cross that the people had put in. And they look, and they're starting to take it down, and then some women who were out doing shopping or doing whatever they needed to do noticed that the government officials were trying to take down the cross. And so they start making a commotion. They run over, and they're trying to stop them. And then word gets out. And then about an hour or so later, the steel mill gets out. And so 5,000 men with pitchforks and shovels, whatever they had, ran to this cross. Said, "You will not take this cross away from here." And there was a big incident that lasted like a week. Said, "You will not take this cross out of here." The people had this longing in their hearts for God. And this was the one symbol that they had to show them that God was still in their society. It was one rallying point that all the people gathered around to say, we will have God in our society. You're not pushing God out of our society. So then on that same trip, on that John Paul II's first voyage, when he goes back to Poland, at Nowa Huta, he writes, he says to the people in that homily, he says, "This new wooden cross was raised not far from here," so where they were at the Mass, "at the very time we were celebrating the millennium." Meaning, John Paul II, in his mind in 79, 78, is already thinking towards the new millennium. With it, we were given a sign that on the threshold of the new millennium, in these times, these new conditions of life, the gospel again is being proclaimed. Right? Just by these people's actions. Just by going to defend this cross, the gospel again is being proclaimed. A new evangelization has begun. As if it were a new proclamation, even if in reality it is the same as ever. The cross stands high over the revolving world. Today, before the cross of Molia, the cross of Nowa Huta, let us give thanks for the new beginning of evangelization that has been brought about here. Let us all pray that it may be as fruitful as the first evangelization. Indeed, even more fruitful. When John Paul II, maybe you've heard the word new evangelization. The church has been using it a lot. And even a couple years ago, back in, I think, 2012, there was a synod on the new evangelization. And this is the first time in this homily that John Paul II talks about the new evangelization. A new evangelization has begun. As if it were a new proclamation, even if in reality it's the same as ever. So John Paul II realizes that, wait a minute, there is this de-Christianization that's trying to occur. The atheists, on the one hand, are trying to do it in Poland. But for ourselves now, I think we might say that secular society and the secularists are trying to de-Christianize our society. But this new evangelization against that, against like the laziness of maybe our society, but the forcefulness of other societies has begun. So this change, this new evangelization, this new way of proclaiming the gospel has begun at Nowa Huta. So then, in his document, as he's getting ready for the change of the millennium, John Paul II writes in his document, it's called Novo Millennium Iniente. And he writes, "The work of evangelization is surely a priority at the dawn of the new millennium." So the Pope is saying, wait a minute. Of all the things that we do, of all the good things that we do, evangelizing has to be a top part of that. It has to be a priority. If we don't do that, we're going to be in trouble. Over the years, I've often repeated the summons to the new evangelization. I do so again now, especially in order to insist that we must rekindle in ourselves the impetus of the beginnings and allow ourselves to be filled with the ardor of the apostolic preaching which followed Pentecost. Remember what happened at Pentecost, right? That these disciples and apostles were just so filled with the Holy Spirit. They were on fire. The tongues of flame descended on them like fire. They were so on fire with their faith that they couldn't help but go out and proclaim this good news to everybody that they met, even if it meant their death. They didn't care because they had hope in the resurrection. They had hope that this life wasn't the end, that there's more than this life. There's something, the beautiful world just beyond this world. So then in 2000 and I was in Rome, my first time and when I entered the seminary, I entered the seminary at St. Paul's Seminary in 1998. And I did 2 years of St. Paul Seminary in Pittsburgh and Crafton in 1998. And then after 2 years, when Bishop Roll was here, he sent me to study in Rome. He asked me to consider going over there. And I had a little bit of a choice, or I kind of asked to go because you could ask at that point. But I got to Rome in the year 2000, the year of the Great Millennium, or 2000, right after 99, and there was all of these Jubilee celebrations all year long. So they would the Pope would kind of have these big celebrations for anybody you can think of. Honestly, there was a Jubilee, so like a gathering, and they brought in everybody of pizza makers. They did. Of pizza makers. They brought in all the religious things, all the teachers, all the things for doctors, for lawyers, for anybody. And so one of the ones that they had was for catechists. They had a Jubilee for catechists. And Cardinal Ratzinger, at the time, gave an address to the catechists. And this address that Cardinal Ratzinger gives kind of helps us to kind of understand what he thought of the new evangelization. And think about and if you remember Pope Benedict, Cardinal Ratzinger becomes Pope Benedict. And it kind of helps us to frame who Pope Benedict was and why he did some of the things he did. So, Cardinal Ratzinger, Pope Benedict, then says, this is the Jubilee of Catechists in December of 2000. And he says, to evangelize means to show the path. I love this line. To evangelize means to show the art of living. At the beginning of his public life, Jesus says, I have come to evangelize the poor. I've come to bring good news to the poor. This means I have the response to your fundamental question. I will show you the path of life, the path towards happiness. Rather, I am that path. Now think about that. I have the response to your fundamental question. So the people in Poland knew, right? They knew what their fundamental question was, but they weren't allowed to find answers to that. They weren't being allowed to find answers. They weren't being allowed to go towards and figure out the answers. For Benedict, Joseph Ratzinger is saying that Jesus said, I have the response to the fundamental questions of why do I exist? Why am I even here? What's the purpose of this life? Isn't there something beyond this? Isn't there something more than this? So, because this is interesting. This will lead us into Pope Francis, okay? Then he says of that day, he says, the deepest poverty is the inability of joy. The tediousness of a life considered absurd and contradictory. This poverty is widespread today in very different forms in the materially rich as well as in poor countries. The inability of joy presupposes and produces the inability to love, produces jealousy, avarice, all defects that devastate the life of individuals in the world. You think about that? I think that's a really neat thought. Because you look at society, and you look at our world, and there's a lot of sadness out there, and there's a lot of depression, and there's a lot of struggling, and there's a lot of pain. And if we don't look to the fundamental realities of our life, and we kind of just say, well, is this it? Is this all there is? How can we have joy? Where does the joy come from? Where do we find the joy? So he's saying the deepest poverty is the inability to have joy, to have joyfulness in our lives. And so then he says on that day, and this is kind of what I was thinking about how Pope Benedict gets interpreted. The church always evangelizes and has never interrupted the path of evangelization. So we say, listen, we've never not evangelized. We've never not proclaimed the good news. We've never not done that. We've always proclaimed the good news. We've always done it. And this is how he says how. The church celebrates the Eucharistic mystery every day and administers the sacraments and proclaims the word of life, the word of God, and commits herself to causes of justice and charity. And this evangelization bears fruit. It gives light and it gives joy. It gives the path of life to many people. Many others live, often unknowingly, in the light and the warmth that radiate from this permanent evangelization. So Benedict has this thought. He's like, wait a minute. We talk about evangelization. We talk about proclaiming the good news and bringing the gospel to people. Well, what does that mean? He's like, listen, we do this all the time. We celebrate the Eucharist every day. And it kind of as an aside. And this is my interpretation of Pope Benedict. Because, people gave him a hard time all the time. Because they said, well, why does he wear like that red coat? And he wears those red shoes. And he does all this finery at Mass. And why does he do that? Why does he dress like that? And if you knew who Pope Benedict was, if you knew Joseph Ratzinger, and I had the chance to meet him once or twice, and he lived in an apartment, a very small apartment, not far from the Vatican, like a block away. And he'd walk through St. Peter's Square on the way to his office. This was before he was Pope, okay? And he would not have the cardinal's garb on. He wouldn't dress like a cardinal at all. You wouldn't even know who he was because he had just a black. In Rome, they all wear the cassock, right? They wear the robe, and he would just be wearing that. And he didn't have a pectoral cross, didn't have a chain, didn't have anything, and he'd just walk across the square. And if you said hello to him, you talked to him. He's very shy, but he would talk to you. And there's this whole story about meeting an American tourist, and then finding that this tourist needed to get shoes, and Ratzinger takes him to go get shoes, and they walk around together. But Pope Benedict, Joseph Ratzinger, becomes Pope Benedict, wasn't necessarily into the flashiness of the office, I don't think. But what he wanted to do, I believe, is when he celebrated the liturgy. Because if he says, this is like the first way we evangelize, this is the first way we bring others to God. So if that's like his idea of how we evangelize, then I think that he wanted the liturgy to be the primary focus of our lives, right? And he wanted to bring people into the transcendent mystery of God and understand the Mass and understand the Eucharist as the mystery that it really is. So he wanted us to have this kind of idea of what is beyond, what is out there, what's waiting for us. And so if we see that in the liturgy, if we see that in the Mass, and we're drawn into the beauty of the Eucharist and drawn into the beauty of it, then we start to understand what it means to know the good news, what it means to know the fundamental questions of life, what it means to know who Jesus is, or who God is. But then Benedict says, or Joseph Ratzinger says, however, we can see a progressive process of de-Christianization and a loss of essential human values, which is worrisome. A large part of today's humanity does not find the gospel in the permanent evangelization of the church. That is to say, the convincing response to the question, how do we live? So what he says then, in the end, finally, is that we're struggling. That we're having a hard time with the kind of the permanent things that we've done for 2,000 years. We need to figure out something different. Okay, then it changes. And then we get this guy called Francis in. And one of the first things that he has to do, one of Francis's first jobs, and I don't know if you remember this, one of the first things that he's supposed to write is this, what's called a post-synodal exhortation. So this letter, this document on the synod that Pope Benedict had just had with all the bishops of the world. And this whole idea of evangelization and what we're supposed to do to evangelize the world. So the first thing that Pope Francis writes to us is the joy of the gospel fills the hearts and lives of all who encounter Jesus. The joy of it, the joy of being Christian is the first thing we experience. Those who accept his offer of salvation are set free from sin, sorrow, inner emptiness, and loneliness. With Christ, joy is constantly born anew. So while the document it's called Evangelii Gaudium, the joy of the gospel, while it outlines all of his thoughts on evangelization and covers a lot of ground, I just want to look at the beginnings of the document. I don't want to go through the whole thing. But Pope Francis wants us to remember over and over and over and over and over and over again. Gospel, joy. Gospel, joy. Gospel equals joy. Joy equals the gospel. If we want to live the gospel, we have to have hearts filled with joy. If we want to know who Jesus is, then we're going to be joyful. The only way to really experience joy is through the gospel. The gospels are full of joy. There's so many places in the gospels that mention joy because there's so many references to joy in them. I think we can overlook them and not give them enough thought. But the Pope gives us a bunch of references to joy in the gospels. He says, this, the gospel is radiant with the glory of Christ's cross, and it constantly invites us to rejoice. A few examples suffice. 1, rejoice. The angel's greeting to Mary. Rejoice, Mary, be happy. 2, Mary's visit to Elizabeth. It makes John leap for joy in his mother's womb. 3, in her song of praise, Mary proclaims, my spirit rejoices in God my Savior. 4, when Jesus begins his earthly ministry, John cries out, for this reason my joy has been fulfilled. And Jesus himself rejoiced in the Holy Spirit. There's a lot of joy in the Gospels. Jesus talks about joy a lot. The Gospels talk about joy. The Pope also points out that we receive joy in the Gospels. Pope Francis writes, Jesus' message brings us joy. He says in John, I have said these things to you so that my joy may be in you and that your joy may be complete. Our Christian joy drinks in the wellspring of his brimming heart. He promises his disciples, you will be sorrowful, but your sorrow will turn into joy. John 16:20. Then he goes on to say, but I will see you again, and your hearts will rejoice, and no one will take your joy from you. 16:22 of John. The disciples rejoiced, John 20:20, at the sight of the risen Christ. Wherever the disciples went, there was great acts of joy. Acts 8:8. Even amid the persecution, they continued to be filled with joy. Acts 13:52. The newly baptized eunuch went on his way rejoicing. Acts 8:39. While Paul's jailer and his entire household rejoiced that he had become a believer in God. Acts 16:34. Why should we not also enter into this great stream of joy, the Pope writes. There's a lot of joy in the gospel. There's a lot of things to be rejoiceful about. This world doesn't give us joy. And if we live in the world, if we become part and saturated with just the world, then it's hard to be joyful. But if we're concentrating on these kinds of things, on the joy that Christ brings us, then there's joy. Obviously, there's a lot of joy in the gospel. It's not something we don't give a lot of thought about, but as you can see, the Lord is instructing us in joy. He wants us to be joy-filled. Pope Francis says, there are Christians whose lives seem like Lent, without Easter. I realize, of course, that joy is not expressed the same way at all times, Pope Francis says, but especially at moments of great difficulty. Joy adapts and changes, but always endures, even as a flicker of light born in our personal certainty that when everything is said and done, we are infinitely loved. One of our big problems in society, and it seems to me, the Pope recognizes it, that we're looking for joy in the wrong places, right? We think if we have the right things, the right friends, the right family, if everything's perfect, then we'll have joy. Pope Francis says, sometimes we're tempted to find excuses and complain and act as if we could only be happy if 1,000 conditions were met. To some extent, this is because our technological society has succeeded in multiplying occasions of pleasure, yet it is found very difficult. It is found very difficult to engender joy. I can say that the most beautiful and natural expression of joy which I have seen in my life were the poor people who had little to hold on to. So I was probably ordained, I think 4 or 5 years, and it was right before I was going back to Rome, and I was sad. I was sad because I didn't want to go back. I don't want to go back to study, but the bishop said we needed somebody to study canon law, and would I do it? And he said, Bishop, if you want me to, that's what I'll do. But I was still sad. It wasn't something that I wanted to do. It really wasn't. And so I went back to my mom and dad's house. There's a little gap in between here. But I went back to my mom and dad's house. My mom was making dinner one night, and I told her, hey, Mom, I have a girlfriend. she gave me the same laugh. She looked at me. And said, what do you do? What do you mean? I said, well, I met this group of nuns, and I was just on retreat at their house, at their convent, and I was just so blown away by them. So they're called the Capuchin Sisters of Nazareth. And they live in the other side of Pennsylvania. They live in the Scranton diocese. But these sisters literally have nothing. My friend, who was the pastor, was Father Shane Kirby, and he lived across the street. They lived in his parish. They lived in one of his convents. He had 2 convents. And it was right before I was going back, as I said. And I told my friend, I told Shane, Father Shane, that I needed to go on a retreat. I knew what was going on in my own heart. I knew I wasn't happy. But I said, before I go back to Rome, to go back to study, I should do a retreat. And so he said I should stay with him. I said, well, I don't know. I don't need to stay with a bunch of sisters. I don't need to stay with... I don't want to find some place to go by myself. And he said, no, seriously, you should think about this. Well, turns out I couldn't find anything else, so I settled for the sisters. And long story short, I went to... Father Kirby came and met me. There's this little town outside of Williamsport called Baxter's, Pennsylvania. And I met my buddy, Father Shane, and then we went over to the convent. And I was going to be there for 5 days. And we rang the doorbell and went inside. Sister Joan comes down to greet me. I had never met the sister before. And she came down, Father! And comes and gives me the biggest hug you can ever imagine. So we are so happy that you're here with us. We're so happy. Because when you're here, then it's like having Jesus in the house. But we're just so happy to have you. Come and stay with us. And so she took me around the whole house. And she showed me everything. She showed me my room, and she showed me their little. She said, "This is the cloister, but maybe you could eat with us up here. But we normally don't allow people here, but you can come and see our kitchen and our whatever it is. And then this is the chapel." She said, "Well, this is the nicest room in the house," and it literally was. It was beautiful. It wasn't like anything outlandish. It was just all wood, and the sisters, they don't own anything at all. They don't. The only thing that they own is a cross. And they didn't tell me this, but I found out. They don't sleep in a bed. They sleep on the floor, like on this mat on the floor. They don't go out to the grocery store because they don't have money. They beg for their food. And people bring them food. The parishioners bring them food. And they're never one for anything. Actually, when Sister first sat me down, she said, "Father, have anything? This is not ours. This is God's. Jesus gave this to us. You should have it." And it's a life of penance. They fast every day. They don't eat meat. Literally, they only eat what the parishioners bring them. They're totally dependent on what it is that people bring them. A typical day for them begins at 6 a.m., and from 6 a.m. to 8 a.m., they pray before the Blessed Sacrament in adoration. At 8 a.m., there's Mass. Then there's breakfast, followed by chores. At noon, they come back, and they pray daytime prayer in the Angelus. They gather again at 4 p.m., for 2 more hours of prayer before the Blessed Sacrament. So that's 4 hours of prayer right there. And then they have dinner, and then they go to bed at 8 p.m. They have night prayer, and then they go to bed at 8 p.m. And then they wake up at 2 a.m. every night to sing the Office of the Reeds, the night vigil. They walk around barefoot. They don't have shoes. If they go outside in the wintertime, they'll have sandals on. The thermostat in the winter is set literally at 55 degrees in their house. But they're the most joyful women you will ever meet. They radiate the joy of Christ. They aren't worried about having things. I've never heard them complain about having a TV and they're not having a TV in their house. They've not been disappointed about living such a demanding life. And a lot of them are young. A lot of them are in their 30s. They came, and sometimes what they'll do, they say they're about 95% contemplative. They call themselves the Capuchin sisters, so they want to live a real Franciscan and austere life. So they wanted to come to Pittsburgh. I said, why don't you come to Pittsburgh? And she said, oh, Father, can we do like a parish mission, like a retreat? I said, sure. So I found one of my friends, Father Steve Neff, and they came to St. Catherine of Sweden. You guys know Father Steve. And they came to Father Steve's place in St. Catherine of Sweden, and they gave a retreat, a parish mission. It was beautiful. It was great. But I invited them over to my parents' house for dinner one night. It was funny, because they sat down on my parents' couch on the sofa, and then my mom and dad were gone. It was just the two sisters and me there. That was it. Father, this is so nice. What's so nice? This is so nice. I'm like, what? Like this couch. Like, we don't have a couch. We don't sit on these things so comfortable. They don't have anything. They don't even have that. But their lives are full of joy. Sister Joan, I'll tell you this story because I've never really told anybody this story. But so I was going back to Rome, and Sister Joan knew it, and she has a big devotion to Padre Pio. And it was the end of my retreat, and I was finishing up, and she knew. And we had done. One of their friends is a hermit in the Scranton Diocese. And he was doing another parish mission not far, so we all went one night, and he had a relic of Padre Pio, and we went and venerated the relic of Padre Pio. And I said, that was a really beautiful experience. Where I have not had a whole lot of devotion to Padre Pio in my life, and but that was really beautiful. So the day I was leaving, she said, Father, I want you to have this. There was a prayer card. And it had a relic, like a little, like a piece of the cloth. I don't know what it was. It's, I think, from one of the gloves that he wore. But I want you to have this. I said, Sister, I can't do this. She said, Father, this is the last thing that I own in my life, and I want you to have it. I said, Sister, I cannot take the last thing that you own. I said, no, Father, this will be it. And God is telling me to give this to you. And so she did. She would not let me not take it. But I can't tell you if I've ever met anybody happier than these sisters, because I haven't, more joyful than these sisters. So it's from this type of voluntary poverty that I can understand Pope Francis when he says our technological society has succeeded in multiplying occasions of pleasure for us, yet found it very difficult to engender real joy. He says, I can say the most beautiful and natural expressions of joy which I have seen in my life were the poor people who had little to hold on to. Because they found meaning in their lives not by owning things, not by worrying about having something good to eat, not even by seeking pleasure from getting 8 straight hours of sleep. They put aside all these distractions and focus on their relationship with Jesus. I think we should go back and listen to Pope Francis's words in his letter. When he says, I never tire of repeating the words of Pope Benedict, which take us to the very heart of the gospel. And this is what Francis is quoting Benedict. This being a Christian is not the result of an ethical choice or a lofty idea, but an encounter with not an encounter with an event, but with a person, which gives life a new horizon and a decisive direction. So being Christian isn't the result of an ethical choice or a lofty idea or an encounter with an event, but an encounter with a person. That's what it means to be Christian, is to have an encounter with a person. I can't tell you how many people think, being Christian just means you have to follow these rules. Being Catholic, well, you have to follow this rule, you have to follow this rule, you have to do this, this, and this, and that's what it's really about, and that's what we're supposed to do. And to really be a true Catholic, to experience the joy that Francis is talking about, that Benedict's talking about, John Paul II is talking about, is an encounter with a person. An encounter with a person in Jesus Christ. It kind of like goes back to those first lines in the Baltimore Catechism. Why did God make you? God made me to know Him, to love Him, to serve Him in this world, and be happy forever with life in the next. You know, when I was a child, Santa would come, and he'd always leave me some sort of electronic toy. And I loved the little the games from Radio Shack that Santa would bring me. And Santa was smart, because he'd always bring the batteries, too, for these games. And he knew if a game needed double-A batteries, or triple-A batteries, or a C-cell, or a D-cell. But when God was designing us, He kind of designed us the same way. Sometimes we try to put AAA batteries into something like us that need AA batteries. It doesn't work. When we try to fill up ourselves with these other things that bring pleasure but not joy, it doesn't work. I think that's why people can lose joy, because they're trying to use the wrong fuel for their lives. God wants to be the fuel in our lives, wants to be the meaning, wants to give us purpose, wants to give us our fulfillment. So there are different states in life, and not all of us are called to be like the Capuchin sisters. Most of us are called to provide for the needs of others. A father of five kids can't say to his family, well, we'll live on the donations of others. So he has to go out and work. And Pope Francis writes about them. He says, I also think the real joy shown by others who, even amid the pressing professional obligations, were able to persevere in detachment and simplicity, heart full of faith. I think of my brother. And I think of him and his wife. They were getting ready to have their first job, my godson. And I should say, my brother is not like a real emotional guy. And he's not too soft. He's pretty driven, and he doesn't say a whole lot of stuff. So anyhow, his wife, my sister-in-law Debbie, was pregnant. And the test came back during the course of the pregnancy. And at one point, the doctors came back and said, you know what? It's highly likely that their child will be born with Down syndrome. And so it was one of those, it was so hard. They were just on pins and needles the whole pregnancy. And so, the doctor said, maybe you should think about not having this child. And obviously, that was not even up for discussion. That wasn't even anything they would discuss. The child God gave them was the child they have. Didn't matter. So the day came for my godson, for Jake, to be born. And my parents went to Mercy Hospital to visit and check up on the baby. And as you can imagine, the main concern that the rest of the house had was Jake, was he going to be healthy? And so my mom, seeing my brother, looked into the nursery and kind of said, John, how's he doing? Are there any problems? And my brother replied by saying, kind of a tear rolling down his eyes, it doesn't even matter. I love him so much already. And as I'm sure all you parents know, that would be your same response too. I love him so much already. And Jake was fine. There's no problems at all. And when you see a new human being, our response can't be but be overwhelmed with joy, overwhelmed with this happiness, this joy. It's a joy that can't be replicated in any other way when you see that newborn baby. And so the Pope reminds us in his letter, in the joy of the gospel, that there is a joy that Christ gives us. A joy where we find complete fulfillment in Him. A joy that can't be derived from anything else. A joy that sustains us. It's a joy that's contagious. A joy that comes from finding fulfillment only in Christ. It's a joy that's found in doing God's will. A joy that comes from living one's vocation. Be it in the married life, as a parent, as a single person, as a religious. It's a joy that's found also in the priestly vocation. And it's a joy that I hope all of you are continually filled with. Thanks.
Any questions for Father Kunz? Questions? I have a couple. When you go to Rome to study, do you have to learn Italian?
You do have to learn Italian. All your classes are in Italian, actually.
No wonder you went on retreat before going.
We cheat. We cheat. We have what's called a note system, so that when you go to class, all the lectures, it's not like here where it's like just a couple of people. It's like a classroom of 200 or 300 people. So there's no questions. And the professor just comes in and lectures. So these guys have been there since Methuselah. They've been there since the church was founded. And they've given the same lecture year after year after year. And so what happens is over the course of time, you get kind of a whole description of what their course is about, all written down. And you can do it in English. And then the only exam you have is right at the end. It's a 10-minute oral exam, and you can take it in English most of the time. So I don't know Italian now.
There's a question?
Can you just talk a little bit about what you do as a canon lawyer?
Oh, sure. So what do I do? When I first came back in 2012, I was really heavily involved in the marriage tribunal. So we're working with annulments. But I've really kind of gotten out of that, out of the annulment side of things in marriage cases. And now I'm more on the side of dealing with all the things in the diocese that I can kind of vet things to make sure that we're doing things canonically correct. Because in the diocese, we have interactions with Rome with the Vatican, not infrequently, but not all the time. But I'm just trying to make sure that everything that we do is correct. So it's a lot of stuff that happens with the clergy. It happens with all the, like if, for example, when there's a project that is over $7.5 million. So for example, Central Catholic High School just built what's called a STEM, the Science, Technology, Engineering, Math building. And that was like a $10 million building that they built. So what I have to do, my job is to make sure that, first of all, we're doing everything correctly in that process. But then what we do is we send this whole binder of things over to Rome to get a permission from them so that we can spend more than $7.5 million. And there are different levels of consultation that Bishop Zubik has to go through. So he has to talk to the priest council, which is made up of all the priests elect among themselves priests who represent all the other priests. And then from them is drawn the consultors. And so the consultors then, they kind of sign off. They have to give their consent. They have to say it's okay to them. There's very few things that the bishop needs consent for, but he does need consent, the permission of the other priests to do a couple things. So that'd be one of them. So my job is to kind of make sure that we're kind of playing by the rules on everything that we do. So Canon kind of guides us. It's kind of like the parameters.
As a lawyer, do you have to go to countries that are mainly not religious in basis? Say, like if you were to go to Laos, would you have to find out the legalities to be able to go into that country?
I don't do a whole lot yet. Outside of the U.S., no. I don't have to do a whole lot of that kind of thing. One of the things that, we have visiting priests. So I do have, one of the priests that I live with is from Africa. And one of my jobs is just to make sure that, we have all the proper permissions for them to come to the United States and make sure that they're okay and their visas are in good shape and all that kind of stuff. So working with legal office, I do a lot of that. So, okay.
How many canon lawyers do we have right now in the diocese?
So we have a bunch. Not all of them work full-time for the diocese. A lot of them are in parishes. So I'm probably one of... I don't work full-time in a parish. I'm full-time in the diocese. But I think we have 6 or 7. So, but a lot of them, like Father Ben Vagetto or Father Dennis Uraka, these are priests or Father Larry DiNardo. They're priests who work for the diocese, but then they have their own parishes as well. So there's a go in between.
With your experience working with annulments, is there a percentage of anybody or people that don't give the annulment? Say the other party, objects or didn't want it, or is there a percentage of people that don't get an annulment?
There is, and it's hard to give it what that is. I'm not exactly sure, and it depends on the case. And I think one of the things that we do in the U.S. is we'll try to help people understand even before they come in whether they're presenting a good case or not. And so there are what are called negative decisions. Yeah, there are. Yeah. But I think as a tribunal, we're always trying to help people too to live out their faith. So it's always trying to come to the truth of the matter when you're looking at it.
Anybody else? And one final question. You quoted a lot from the popes. Is there a place where, as lay people, we can get summaries of these, like the Joy of the Gospel? Is like the Pittsburgh Catholic a good place to look for a summary of these papers, these documents?
Yeah, you could, I think you could read the whole things.
As I said, is there a good place for a summary?
But yeah, there are. If you go on the websites too, if you the Pittsburgh Catholic had some things on the Joy of the Gospel, and if you type in, if you Google some of the things like the Joy of the Gospel, it'll come up. But then there'll be stories like the National Catholic Register, other things kind of do stuff on it too. Yeah, so you'll be able to find some summaries of it. Yeah.
Father Tom, thanks.
Sure. Thanks.